All units, consolidate positions. Repeat, consolidate and hold. The transmission from Egyptian 21st Armored Division Headquarters, October 15, 1973, 3:47 p.m. Colonel Hassan Abu Saada, commanding 136 tanks, a mix of T-62s with their smoothbore 115mm guns and older T-55s mounting 100mm rifled cannons. His division's mission? Protect 3rd Army's bridgehead on the Sinai side of Suez Canal. The Egyptian crossing 3 days earlier had worked. Soviet doctrine executed properly. Bridging equipment positioned correctly, engineer units clearing Israeli obstacles, armor pushing through to establish defensive perimeter. 3rd Army now held roughly 12 kilometers of Sinai east of the canal. The 21st Armored Division positioned to defend the northern approach, specifically the area Israelis called Chinese Farm, for reasons having nothing to do with China. Japanese Agricultural Experimental Station from the 1930s. Hebrew misidentification stuck. Abu Saada's tanks distributed across irrigation ditches and embankments. Defensive positions offering good fields of fire toward the roads Israelis would need to use for any counterattack. The terrain favored defense. Water obstacles, soft sand between hard-packed roads, limited maneuver space. Israeli intelligence counted his tanks accurately. 136, mostly T-62s, which mattered. The T-62 represented Soviet armor's first smoothbore cannon design, higher muzzle velocity, than the T-55's rifled gun, better armor penetration at range. Egyptian crews trained in USSR, doctrine emphasizing long-range engagement, keep distance, use the T-62's superior ballistics. Israeli Suez defense by October 14th had collapsed in most sectors. Bar-Lev Line strongpoints overrun or bypassed. Egyptian 2nd Army held bridgehead in north, 3rd Army in south. The space between, near Deversoir and the Chinese Farm area, represented the gap, narrow enough that Egyptian armor from both armies could support each other, wide enough that neither had pushed through completely. Radio call sign designations for Egyptian armor units that night followed a pattern I still can't decode. 1st Battalion, 21st Armored used Sword prefix, Sword 1 through Sword 14. 2nd Battalion used Shield designations, but 3rd Battalion radio logs show Spear for some platoons, Arrow for others, and 2 companies using numerical-only identifiers. Soviet doctrine manuals I've read specify consistent nomenclature across battalion structure. Egyptian adaptation or breakdown of Soviet system? The pattern exists in multiple engagement records from Yom Kippur War, but nobody's explained it. Abu Saada positioned his command post roughly 3 kilometers east of the canal. Good radio contact with subordinate units, direct line of sight to main approach routes. The defensive mathematics looked solid. 136 tanks, prepared positions, good fields of fire, difficult terrain for attackers. Egyptian doctrine emphasized defense, accepting battle on favorable terms. Israeli reconnaissance detected the positions. Aerial photography showed the tank concentrations, infantry support positions, supply routes. Southern Command understood what 136 Egyptian tanks meant. Any attempt to reach the canal in this sector required destroying or bypassing Abu Saada's armor. Neither option looked promising on paper. The numbers from October 14th, the previous day, made Egyptian confidence reasonable. Israeli armored counterattack against 2nd Army bridgehead in north. 250 Israeli tanks engaged, roughly 150 destroyed or disabled. Egyptian Sagar anti-tank missiles and dug-in armor inflicted unprecedented casualties. Abu Saada's officers knew these statistics. Their defensive posture had worked catastrophically well against Israeli tank-heavy doctrine. But Ariel Sharon, commanding Israeli 143rd Armored Division, wasn't planning to attack the bridgehead. He intended to ignore it. Cross the canal in the gap, establish Israeli bridgehead on Egyptian side, roll up 3rd Army from behind. The 21st Armored Division happened to be positioned exactly where Sharon needed to move his crossing equipment. The collision became inevitable around 4 p.m. October 15th. Ariel Sharon took command of the 143rd Armored Division on October 9, 1973, 3 days into the war. His reputation: aggressive, insubordinate, effective. Southern Command tolerated him because Egyptian bridgeheads demanded solutions, not compliance with chain of command niceties. The plan Sharon proposed on October 12th violated basic armor doctrine. Instead of destroying Egyptian bridgeheads through frontal assault, which had failed catastrophically on October 14th, cross the Suez Canal in reverse. Put Israeli armor on the Egyptian side, cut 3rd Army supply lines, collapse their bridgehead from behind. The crossing point: Deversoir, where Great Bitter Lake met Suez Canal. Israeli intelligence identified a gap between Egyptian 2nd and 3rd Armies. Roughly 4 kilometers of canal held by light infantry, no armor concentration, limited anti-tank defenses. The gap existed because Egyptian operational planning assumed Israelis would defend, not counterattack, across water. Southern Command approved the operation October 15th, 2:30 p.m. The timeline: assault begins after nightfall. Bridging equipment reaches canal by midnight. Paratroopers cross in rubber boats during darkness. Armor follows at dawn once bridges operational. The approach route required moving through Chinese farm. Single dirt road capable of handling tanks and bridging equipment. Israeli engineers identified it as Route Turter on maps. Realistically, the only path that could support the weight of bridge sections and the armored vehicles needed to protect them. Egyptian 21st Armored Division sat directly across that route. Sharon understood the collision. His planning documents from October 15th afternoon acknowledged it explicitly. Enemy armor will contest approach to crossing point. Accept engagement to secure route. The mathematics: Egyptian 21st Armored fielded 136 tanks in prepared defensive positions. Sharon's 143rd Division could commit roughly 200 tanks to the assault, but most needed to continue toward the canal with bridging equipment, not stop to fight Egyptian armor. The force composition reflected the dual mission. Lead elements: paratroopers from Colonel Danny Matt's 247th Reserve Parachute Brigade, tasked with securing the actual crossing site. Following: Colonel Haim Erez's Armored Brigade with Centurion tanks and M50 Super Shermans, responsible for protecting bridging equipment. The bridge sections themselves: massive roller bridge units requiring tank transporters, vulnerable to any anti-tank fire. Timing became the critical variable. Sharon needed bridging equipment at the canal by midnight to begin crossing before Egyptian reinforcements arrived. The distance from Israeli staging areas to Deversoir: roughly 18 kilometers. Cross-country speed for bridge transporters: maybe 15 kilometers per hour on good terrain. Route Turter didn't qualify as good terrain. Soft sand, irrigation ditches, vegetation. Realistic transit time: 90 minutes minimum, assuming no opposition. Egyptian 21st Armored blocked the route. Bypassing meant leaving an intact enemy armor division behind your lines while conducting opposed water crossing. Unacceptable. Destroying them meant stopping, deploying, fighting a set-piece engagement, consuming the hours needed for crossing operations. Sharon's decision at 4 p.m., drive through, accept casualties, maintain momentum, reach the canal regardless of opposition. The Israeli armor would engage Egyptian tanks while moving, suppress them enough to let bridging equipment pass, continue toward Deversoir. The order went to Erez's brigade. Attack at 8 p.m., darkness, providing some cover from Egyptian long-range gunnery. Paratroopers would infiltrate forward during the approach, seize crossing point, while armor engaged Egyptian 21st. Bridging equipment would follow the fighting, protected by suppressive fire. Nobody used the word suicidal in planning documents. The operational analysis acknowledged projected casualties, 30 to 40% tank losses expected. For a force of 200 tanks, that meant 60 to 80 destroyed. The losses Sharon considered acceptable to establish the bridgehead. October 15th, 7:30 p.m. Israeli columns began moving toward Chinese farm. Egyptian listening posts detected engine noise, reported movement to Abu Saada's headquarters. The 21st Armored Division went to combat alert, contact in 30 minutes. Colonel Haim Erez commanded the lead Israeli armored element. Roughly 90 tanks split between two battalion-sized formations. His Centurions carried the British-designed 105mm L7 gun, proven effective against Soviet armor at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. The M50 Super Shermans, American World War II hulls retrofitted with French 75mm high-velocity cannons, provided additional firepower despite their obsolescent armor protection. Behind Erez's tanks, the bridging equipment. Israeli forces employed two types for Suez crossing operations. Roller bridges, prefabricated metal sections transported on modified tank chassis, designed to unfold across water gaps, and motorized rafts capable of ferrying individual tanks across before permanent bridges deployed. Each bridge section weighed multiple tons, required dedicated transport vehicles, moved at glacial speeds cross-country. The paratroopers from Danny Matt's 247th Brigade traveled in half-tracks and BTR-50 armored personnel carriers, the latter captured from Egyptians in 1967, now pressed into Israeli service. Their mission? Reach the canal first, establish security perimeter, prepare crossing site for bridge emplacement. Route Turner funneled everything into single file. The dirt road, barely 15 feet wide in sections, couldn't accommodate two-way traffic. Irrigation ditches flanked both sides. Egyptian agricultural development from the 1960s, creating a network of water obstacles. Vehicles leaving the hard-packed road risked bogging in soft sand. The column stretched for kilometers. Tanks, bridging equipment, fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, command vehicles, recovery vehicles, all proceeding nose to tail at maybe 20 kilometers per hour. Israeli doctrine emphasized speed and maneuver. This advance resembled a traffic jam more than armored assault. Egyptian observers detected the movement at 7:52 p.m. Radio intercepts later recovered showed the progression of reports to 21st Armored Division headquarters. Engine noise sector 4. Then multiple vehicles moving east to west. Then estimate battalion strength, possibly larger. Colonel Abu Saada ordered his northern battalions forward. Egyptian doctrine for meeting engagement. Establish firing positions at maximum range. Engage with main guns before enemy closest distance. His T-62s could effectively engage targets beyond 2,000 meters in daylight. Darkness complicated the mathematics, but Egyptian tanks carried infrared searchlights, active IR systems that illuminated targets for gunners wearing night vision optics. First contact occurred at 8:17 p.m., roughly 3 kilometers east of the intended crossing point. An Egyptian T-62 platoon positioned along an irrigation embankment opened fire on lead Israeli Centurions. Range, approximately 1,800 meters. Darkness degraded accuracy, but Egyptian gunners could see the infrared signatures of Israeli tank engines. Erez faced immediate decision: deploy for battle or continue moving. Deploying meant stopping the column, allowing tanks to maneuver off route Turner into firing positions, establishing proper engagement formation. Standard armored doctrine. But stopping meant the bridging equipment stopped. Sharon's timeline required continuous movement. Erez ordered tanks to return fire while advancing. The Centurions engaged Egyptian positions from the road, main guns firing on the move. Technique that sacrificed accuracy for momentum. Israeli doctrine trained for this, gunnery exercises emphasizing stabilization systems that allowed reasonable hit probability, even from moving platforms. The column kept moving. Lead tanks absorbed the engagement. Trailing vehicles continued toward the canal. Egyptian fire intensified as more T-62s joined the battle. Israeli tanks began taking hits. 115mm armor-piercing rounds punching through Centurion frontal armor at these ranges. Catastrophic penetrations that left tanks burning. By 8:45 p.m., Erez had lost 7 Centurions destroyed, another 4 damaged but mobile. The column had advanced maybe 2 kilometers, still 5 kilometers from the crossing site. Egyptian 21st Armored Division now fully alerted, additional battalions moving to block route Turdur. And the sun had set completely. What followed would occur in near-total darkness. Night tank combat eliminates most advantages of modern fire control systems. Optical rangefinders require visible targets. Ballistic computers need accurate range data. Gunners need to identify friend from enemy before firing. Darkness reduces armored warfare to World War II fundamentals. See the enemy first, shoot first, hope your armor holds. Egyptian T-62 tanks carried Luna infrared searchlights mounted coaxially with main guns. Active IR system. The searchlight projected infrared beam invisible to naked eye. Gunner viewed. Reflected IR through night vision optics. Effective range may be 800 meters under ideal conditions. The Chinese farm terrain, with its vegetation and irrigation ditches, reduced that to 400 meters practically. Israeli Centurions lacked standardized night vision equipment in 1973. Some tanks carried British-designed IR systems. Most relied on white light searchlights or ambient moonlight. The October moon phase, waning crescent, minimal illumination. Centurion commanders resorted to firing illumination rounds. Artillery shells that burst overhead, suspended on parachutes, bathed battlefield in harsh magnesium light for 30 to 40 seconds before burning out. The illumination created strobing effect. 30 seconds of visibility, then darkness, then another illumination round, darkness again. Egyptian and Israeli gunners both fired during the lit intervals, then repositioned during darkness, trying to avoid being in the same spot when next illumination burst overhead. Muzzle flash became primary targeting reference. A T-62's 115mm gun produced distinctive orange-white flash, visible for kilometers in darkness. Israeli gunners trained to engage muzzle flash locations. Fire where you saw the enemy shoot. Hope they hadn't moved yet. Egyptian crews employed same technique. The result? Both sides shooting at gun flashes, often hitting positions the enemy had already vacated. Range compression in darkness fundamentally changed engagement geometry. In daylight, Israeli doctrine emphasized long-range gunnery, engaging Egyptian armor at 2,000+ meters, where superior fire control systems provided advantage. Night fighting collapsed engagement ranges to 300 to 500 meters, distances where Egyptian numerical superiority and prepared positions offset Israeli technical edge. The sound changed combat dynamics. Tank commanders couldn't see much, but they could hear everything. The distinctive crack of 115mm smoothbore differed from the sharper report of 105mm rifled guns. Experienced crews identified incoming fire by sound. High-velocity crack meant armor-piercing round passing close. Deeper whump meant high-explosive missing wide. Israeli tanks began taking casualties from angles their crews never saw. Egyptian T-62s positioned in irrigation ditches, hull down behind embankments, fired into the flanks of Israeli columns, still trying to advance along route Turdur. The Centurion's frontal armor could resist T-62 fire at these ranges. Maybe. Side armor couldn't. Armor-piercing rounds entering from 90-degree angles punched through into crew compartments, ammunition storage, fuel tanks. By 9:30 p.m., route Turdur resembled a linear killing ground. Burning Israeli tanks marked the column's progress, each wreck a navigation point for Egyptian gunners. Erez's battalions had lost cohesion, individual tanks fighting separate engagements rather than coordinated actions. Radio discipline deteriorated as commanders shouted target locations, damage reports, requests for support. Friendly fire incidents began. Israeli tanks engaging muzzle flashes couldn't always distinguish Centurion gun signatures from T-62s. At least 3 Israeli tanks took hits from other Israeli tanks, firing at perceived threats. The illumination rounds made it worse. Harsh shadows and sudden light changes created false targets, movement where none existed. Egyptian casualties mounted simultaneously. Israeli tanks might be confused and disorganized, but they kept firing. T-62s positioned to ambush the column found themselves targeted by multiple Centurions once illumination revealed their positions. The Egyptian advantage of prepared defensive positions eroded as Israeli tanks refused to stop, refused to withdraw, just kept pushing forward while shooting. The bridging equipment somehow continued moving. Protected by the chaos ahead, the massive roller bridge transporters ground forward at 10 kilometers per hour. By 10 p.m., Colonel Abu Saada's situation reports to Egyptian Third Army headquarters acknowledged losses but maintained defensive confidence. His 21st Armored Division had destroyed or disabled an estimated 25 Israeli tanks. His own casualties, 11 T-62s confirmed lost, perhaps 8 more damaged. The exchange ratio favored Egypt. Israeli attack appeared stalled along Route Terter, exactly as defensive doctrine predicted. The assessment missed critical details. Israeli columns weren't stalling. They were fighting through. The difference mattered enormously. A stalled attack could be contained, reinforced against, eventually destroyed. An attack fighting through would reach its objective regardless of casualties. Egyptian reinforcements arrived from Third Army Reserve. Additional T-55 battalion, roughly 30 tanks, positioned south of Chinese Farm to block any Israeli breakthrough toward the canal. Abu Saada now commanded approximately 155 tanks total. His original 136 minus losses, plus the reinforcement battalion. The expanded defensive line covered more of the approaches to Deversoir. Israeli forces also received reinforcements. Colonel Amnon Reshef's armored battalion, 22 Centurions, arrived from Southern Command Reserve at 10:15 p.m. with orders to support Erez's assault. Reshef's battalion entered the battle from a different axis, approaching from northeast, rather than following Route Terter. The maneuver aimed to envelope Egyptian positions, attack from multiple directions simultaneously. It worked briefly. Egyptian tanks oriented toward Route Terter suddenly took fire from their flank. Reshef's Centurions engaged T-62 positions from 800 meters, achieving surprise. 4 Egyptian tanks destroyed in the first 5 minutes of Reshef's engagement. Then Egyptian Reserve Battalion repositioned. The 30 T-55s that had been blocking southern approaches turned northeast, moved to counter Reshef's thrust. By 10:45 p.m., Reshef's 22 Centurions faced 30 T-55s plus elements of Abu Saada's original force, roughly 45 Egyptian tanks converging on his position. Radio transcripts from Reshef's battalion show the progression. 10:47 p.m. Taking fire from 3 directions, request immediate support. 10:52 p.m. Lost 3 tanks, ammunition critical. 10:58 p.m. Cannot hold position, must withdraw or reinforce now. No reinforcements available. Erez's force still engaged along Route Terter. Danny Matt's paratroopers had reached the canal but lacked heavy weapons to support Reshef. Southern Command had committed its available armor already. Reshef's battalion fought surrounded for the next 2 hours. Israeli doctrine emphasized maneuver and withdrawal when flanked. Reshef couldn't withdraw. Pulling back meant abandoning Route Terter, allowing Egyptian armor to cut the supply line to paratroopers already crossing the canal. His orders: hold regardless of cost. The attrition mathematics accelerated after midnight. Egyptian tanks continued engaging from prepared positions, Israeli tanks maneuvered in darkness through unfamiliar terrain, but Egyptian ammunition supply began failing. T-62 main gun ammunition storage, 40 rounds. By 1 a.m., some Egyptian tanks had expended most of their combat load, required resupply from rear areas. The resupply vehicles couldn't reach forward positions through Israeli fire. Israeli casualties mounted in absolute numbers, but Egyptian losses mounted faster in percentage terms. By 3 a.m., Abu Saada's operational tank strength had dropped below 70, roughly half his starting force. The Israeli attack had cost him 65 tanks, destroyed or immobilized. Reshef's battalion, despite being surrounded, had accounted for 18 Egyptian tanks through sheer sustained gunnery. The 96-tank difference emerged from cumulative attrition over 7 hours of night combat. Egyptian 21st Armored Division started with 136 tanks, reinforced to 155, reduced to 40 operational by dawn. Israeli forces started with roughly 200 tanks, committed to the battle, lost 56 destroyed, and the bridging equipment kept moving forward. The period from midnight to 4 a.m. determined which force would break first. Egyptian 21st Armored Division maintained defensive positions, but faced degrading ammunition supply, mounting casualties, and zero prospect of meaningful reinforcement. Third Army headquarters couldn't send additional armor. Second Army in the north required all available reserves to counter separate Israeli attacks. Israeli forces faced different mathematics, casualties horrific by any standard, but the mission didn't require destroying Egyptian armor completely. It required suppressing them long enough for bridging equipment to reach the canal and paratroopers to cross. Every hour of continued combat moved bridging equipment closer to Deversoir. Ammunition resupply became the determining factor. Israeli logistics had prepared for the offensive. Supply trucks carrying 105mm tank ammunition, fuel, and replacement crew members followed the columns along Route Terter. Dangerous work, unarmored trucks moving through active combat zone, but the supplies reached forward positions. Israeli tanks that exhausted their 60-round combat loads could replenish. Egyptian logistics hadn't anticipated defensive battle of this intensity in this location. Abu Saada's supply vehicles staged several kilometers east, relative safety, but significant distance from engaged units. Moving ammunition forward required crossing ground covered by Israeli fire. Several Egyptian supply trucks destroyed attempting the run. Others refused to try. By 1:30 a.m., Egyptian tank commanders reported critical ammunition shortages, some T-62s down to 5 main gun rounds remaining. Doctrine specified withdrawal when ammunition dropped below 10 rounds. Maintain reserve for defensive retreat. Abu Saada ordered units to hold position regardless, conserve ammunition, engage only certain targets. The conservation order reduced Egyptian fire volume substantially. Israeli tanks advancing along Route Terter encountered less resistance. Erez's battalion, which had been fighting continuously since 8:17 p.m., finally achieved breakthrough toward Canal at 2:15 a.m. Not because Egyptian defenders fled, because they stopped shooting to preserve ammunition. Reshef's surrounded battalion continued fighting. His 22 Centurions, reduced to 11 operational by 2 a.m., engaged Egyptian armor at ranges sometimes dropping below 100 meters. Point-blank gunnery in darkness. The engagement devolved into mutual destruction, both sides taking catastrophic losses, but neither able to disengage. Egyptian casualties accelerated after 2:30 a.m., despite reduced Israeli pressure. Tanks immobilized earlier in the battle, crews waiting for recovery or resupply, became targets for Israeli artillery. Southern Command had positioned 155mm gun batteries to support the crossing operation. The artillery shifted fire from planned targets to reported Egyptian tank concentrations. High explosive shells don't reliably destroy tanks, but they kill exposed crew members, damage optics and external equipment, force buttoned-up operations. The attrition curve showed different slopes for each side. Egyptian losses climbed steeply from midnight to 3 a.m. 65 tanks lost in 3 hours. Israeli losses climbed more gradually, but to higher absolute numbers. 56 tanks destroyed over the entire 8-hour engagement. By 4 a.m., Egyptian 21st Armored Division had effectively ceased functioning as coherent formation. The 40 operational tanks remained scattered across Chinese farm, some still fighting, others withdrawn to defensive positions, most without sufficient ammunition to sustain combat. Abu Saada's command post had lost radio contact with multiple subordinate units. Israeli forces controlled Route Terter. The bridging equipment, somehow intact despite hours of combat around it, reached the Suez Canal at 4:23 a.m. Engineers began emplacing roller bridges across the water. Danny Matt's paratroopers, who had crossed in rubber boats starting at midnight, secured the western bank. The battle continued. Egyptian armor hadn't surrendered, just lost capability to prevent the crossing. Reshef's battalion still fought surrounded, down to 7 operational tanks. But the mission had succeeded. Sharon's gamble paid. Accept horrific casualties, maintain momentum, reach the canal. Israeli bridgehead on Egyptian soil established while fighting still raged. Dawn arrived October the 16th at 6:12 a.m. First light revealed the battlefield's actual geometry, what night combat had obscured. Route Terter marked by burning vehicle hulks, Egyptian and Israeli tanks destroyed within meters of each other. Terrain cratered by artillery and mine explosions. The irrigation ditches served as mass graves for vehicles that slid off the road during darkness. Combat continued despite daylight. Egyptian 21st Armored Division's surviving tanks, now visible to each other and to Israeli forces, attempted to regroup. Some platoons withdrew eastward, away from the canal. Others held positions and continued engaging Israeli armor. Colonel Abu Saada's command structure had fractured. Individual company and platoon commanders making tactical decisions without coordinated direction. The bridging operation proceeded under fire. Israeli engineers worked on the canal banks, while Egyptian artillery and occasional tank rounds impacted around them. The roller bridges, designed for rapid deployment, required precise alignment and connection of sections. Engineers exposed on the banks, welding metal connections, measuring angles. Several killed by shrapnel, replaced by others who continued the work. Egyptian bridge demolition procedures. I found 3 different technical manuals from the period, all specifying different methods. Soviet doctrine from 1968 emphasized underwater charges placed by combat divers. Egyptian adaptation in 1971 manual shows preference for artillery interdiction of bridge approaches rather than physical demolition. But a classified Israeli intelligence assessment from 1972 describes Egyptian specialized engineer units trained in shaped charge deployment against pontoon bridges. Which method Egyptian forces actually employed at Chinese farm? None of them, apparently. Third Army engineer assets were committed to maintaining their own Suez bridges further south. Nobody available to demolish Israeli crossing even when its location became obvious. By 7 a.m., first Israeli tanks crossed on completed roller bridge. Centurions moving single file across metal span, while firefight continued 3 kilometers east. The tactical absurdity: conducting river crossing under fire from enemy armor. You haven't destroyed yet. Sharon's concept required accepting this risk. Danny Matt's paratroopers on the western bank established defensive perimeter roughly 2 kilometers in diameter. Egyptian forces on the African side of Suez, minimal in this sector. The gap between 2nd and 3rd armies that made the crossing feasible. Some Egyptian infantry positions, scattered anti-aircraft batteries, supply depots. Matt's force overwhelmed them through speed and surprise. Israeli bridgehead expanded throughout the morning. Additional tanks crossed, followed by mechanized infantry, artillery, supply vehicles. By 10 a.m., Southern Command had 2 armored brigades on Egyptian soil, roughly 80 tanks, enough to begin offensive operations against Third Army's rear areas. The battle at Chinese Farm wound down through mutual exhaustion rather than decisive conclusion. Reshef's surrounded battalion, reduced to 4 operational centurions by 9 a.m., finally received relief when additional Israeli armor broke through. Egyptian resistance collapsed in most sectors by noon, surviving tanks withdrawing eastward. Final casualty counts emerged over subsequent days. Egyptian 21st Armored Division, 96 tanks destroyed or captured, 40 damaged, unknown number of crew casualties. Israeli forces, 56 tanks destroyed, 71 damaged but recoverable, approximately 300 personnel killed or wounded. The statistics understated Israeli tactical failure and strategic success. Tactically, the engagement represented costly frontal assault against prepared defenses, exactly the kind of battle Israeli doctrine aimed to avoid. Casualty ratios favored neither side decisively. But strategically, Sharon achieved his objective. Israeli bridgehead established Third Army supply lines now vulnerable to attack from the west. Egyptian Third Army would be encircled within 4 days. The reversal of fortunes in Sinai traced directly to the brutal night at Chinese Farm, the battle Sharon fought through rather than winning. Colonel Amnon Reshef survived Chinese Farm. His 4 remaining centurions withdrew from the battlefield October 16th, crews exhausted, vehicles damaged, but mobile. Reshef himself uninjured physically. Remarkable, given the 7 hours his battalion spent surrounded and engaged from multiple directions. The injuries came later. Medical understanding of tank crew trauma in 1973 focused on visible wounds, burns, shrapnel, broken bones. The invisible damage from sustained combat in enclosed metal spaces went undiagnosed. Overpressure from nearby impacts, repeated concussive effects, toxic fumes from burning equipment, and propellant charges. Reshef continued serving after the war. Promoted to brigade command, later division command. Israeli armor doctrine underwent substantial revision based on Yom Kippur war lessons, and Reshef contributed to the analysis. His after-action reports on Chinese Farm emphasized night combat deficiencies, ammunition resupply under fire, coordination between armor and bridging units. He retired from active service in 1980. The medical problems started appearing 1982. Respiratory issues initially, persistent cough, reduced lung capacity. Doctors attributed it to desert service, suggested climate change might help. The headaches began 1984. Severe, recurring, unresponsive to standard treatment. Neurological examination revealed nothing definitive. By 1986, Reshef required regular hospital treatment. The respiratory condition had progressed to chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. The headaches accompanied by memory issues, coordination problems. Military physicians began suspecting connection to combat exposure, specifically the prolonged period inside damaged, burning tanks during Yom Kippur War. The medical literature from the period shows limited understanding of long-term armor crew health effects. Burns and immediate trauma received extensive study. Cumulative exposure to propellant gases, hydraulic fluid vapors, burning composite materials inside damaged vehicles, almost nothing documented. Reshef's medical file listed cause as complications related to military service without specifics. He died March 1987, 14 years after Chinese Farm. Age 52. The funeral at Kinneret Cemetery drew substantial attendance. Fellow officers from the war, government officials, family. The eulogy mentioned his service, his leadership during the crossing operation, his contributions to armored doctrine development. What the eulogy didn't mention, how many others from Chinese Farm died years later from similar causes. Israeli military medical records from the period remain partially classified, but academic research published in the 1990s identified patterns. Tank crews from prolonged Yom Kippur War engagements showed elevated rates of respiratory disease, neurological conditions, cancers potentially linked to toxic exposure. The official casualty statistics from Chinese Farm, 300 killed or wounded, count only immediate battlefield losses. The delayed casualties, soldiers who survived the night but died from exposure-related conditions over the following decades, don't appear in any summary I've found. No comprehensive study tracked the long-term health outcomes of survivors. Reshef's grave marker at Kinneret lists his rank or service dates, decorations, standard military headstone, nothing indicating he died from wounds sustained in 1973. Just recognized 14 years later. The mathematics of Chinese Farm continue changing depending on how you count. Immediate Israeli losses, 56 tanks, 300 casualties. Egyptian losses, 96 tanks destroyed, division rendered combat ineffective. Strategic outcome, successful crossing, Third Army encircled, war trajectory reversed. But if you count Reshef and others who died later from combat-related conditions, the casualty figures grow. How much? The records don't specify. Some survived Chinese Farm only to die in military hospitals years afterward, their deaths attributed to natural causes or unspecified service complications, rather than a specific October night in 1973. The battle that never quite ended, even for those who left the battlefield alive.